Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, June 23rd, 2020. Healthcare is a critical issue at a time like this. As the pandemic is raging, people are fearful of added medical expenses, and many people who are no longer working or experiencing a lengthy layoff have lost their employer-paid health insurance coverage. So the Republicans finally seem to be facing up to their to the price that they for 10 years of threatening to repeal and replace Obamacare. And the Democrats see an opening here, but they won't exploit it as I would like to see. So according to the New York Times, and they interviewed a number of Republican strategists, they have recognized that they've reached a critical point because within the next week or two, the White House is expected to file legal briefs asking the Supreme Court to euthanize Obamacare. And this is based on a court ruling that they shopped for in Texas from a federal district court that declared that without the personal mandate, the entire law is either unconstitutional or inoperable. And of course, all along, they have used the double R, right? Repeal and replace. And never even for a minute has a single Republican, to my knowledge, stepped up and said, okay, here's what I would replace it with. And of course, the orange man has threatened for years that he's got a beautiful idea that we're going to love. He just hasn't bothered to even tweet about it. So the clock is ticking for the Republican efforts to slay Obama's dragon, and the Democrats see a moment that they can seize here. They are looking for ways to shore up the Affordable Care Act. So Nancy Pelosi is putting together a bill which is aimed at reducing premiums by expanding the subsidies for people who buy health care from the for-profit insurance industry. And the Republicans are looking for some kind of a miracle to try to either provide an alternative that would satisfy the millions of people who would lose coverage if Obamacare is vanquished. And their commitment to, calling it socialism, and therefore, if it just goes away, people are on their own and they'll either die or go bankrupt, or maybe go bankrupt and then die. But what really bothers me is that the Democrats know that whatever bill they write is dead on arrival in the current United States Senate. And so the article assures us here is that aides to Speaker Pelosi say that a public option to create a government-run health insurer will not be included. Now, they won't even tip their hands to the Bernie Sanders movement. Medicare for all, single payer. They could do so by writing into this bill a lowering of the age of eligibility for Medicare from 65, or I guess it's 66 now, to 55. But they're not doing that. And this appears to be based on what they consider to be a successful political strategy in 2018, where they only ran on health care limited to the idea that repealing Obamacare would end the coverage for pre-existing conditions, and that COVID could become a pre-existing condition that would either limit people's potential to get health care coverage or make it so expensive that it is out of their reach. And so this is so disappointing, because at a time when the Democrats could stand up and stand for something, in the face of this cruel effort by Republicans to just clobber Obamacare and leave millions of people exposed. And it shows the extent to which the Democrats are beholden to the same pool of corporate donors, including in the healthcare industry, as the Republicans. And that's why we get stuck, like we are, on healthcare. Now, this is very interesting. As you know, the Trump administration, just days before the Supreme Court, established that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 covers issues related to sex, including the workplace rights of gay and transgender human beings. And on the Friday before that, the Trump administration announced a new rule narrowing the legal definition of sex discrimination under Obamacare. And while ultimately litigation should extend the standard that Associate Justice Gorsuch wrote in the opinion for the majority in the civil rights case, for the time being, the Trump administration appears to be content to try to bash gay and transgender people for political gain, to try to get more of the base fired up to show up in November. And this is a move that's part of a broad set of policy changes that weaken safeguards for transgender people across multiple sectors, including education, employment, and housing. And as I say, the courts will likely overturn this, but it will take a while. So what's interesting here is that the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, the health insurance plans, American Medical Student Association, the Human Rights Campaign, the ACLU, Lambda Legal's Transgender Rights Project, they all oppose this and announced they're planning to sue the government in an effort to overturn these rulemakings by the Trump administration. But get this. Here's the big surprise. The Catholic Health Association, which represents the largest nonprofit provider of health care services in the country, opposes the rule as well. Sister Mary Haddad, president and chief executive of the association, maybe didn't check with the male bishops before she made this statement. While we welcome the efforts to reaffirm the unique mission of faith-based healthcare providers, refusing to provide medical assistance or healthcare services merely because of discomfort with, animus against an individual on the basis of how that person understands or expresses gender or sexuality is unacceptable. Well, it's about time to see Catholics operate like small c Christians, and to avoid supporting the Trump administration because it is nominally opposed to abortion and even contraception. And they've got Maine Senator Susan Collins on the hot seat. She's one of few Republicans even talking about this at all. The Trump administration's decision to eliminate protections for transgender patients is simply wrong. I'll work to overturn this discriminatory policy. Yeah, she's up for re-election in November, and she knows it. Now, in a slightly tangential issue, we are expecting a report from a panel that was established by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a commission to provide a new vision for human rights policy that would more closely align with the nation's founding principles and uphold religious freedom as America's most fundamental value. Now, Pompeo goes through the motions of criticizing China for the Uyghurs, but he toadies up to Saudi Arabia. He's silent about the human rights abuses of just about every country that he visits. And so, as an evangelical Christian with political ambitions said to include the presidency, Pompeo is hoping to roll out a commission report that is going to substitute religious freedom for the broad notion of human rights. And this is pretty sick, in my view. I think it demeans religion, and it sullies the broadly accepted notion of human rights as well. A Missouri appeals court today has ordered Johnson & Johnson to pay $2.1 billion, and that is down from the jury award of $4.69 billion, in compensatory and punitive damages to a group of women who blamed their ovarian cancer on using baby powder and other talcum products, which had traces of asbestos. J&J, which has been tapped to profit from a potential potential vaccination against the coronavirus. They say, well, this is just a misunderstanding, a fundamentally flawed trial, grounded in a faulty presentation of the facts. Well, jury awards are often reduced, but that is still a substantial amount of money, and once J&J gets past its denial, maybe they'll fix the problem. I want to commend the Guardian newspaper from Britain. I often do criticize it for some of its international coverage. But it has a group of reporters in the United States who put to shame those who work for major media outlets based here in the U.S. So today, in an exclusive investigative piece, they reveal that millions of Americans can't afford the water that comes out of their tap. Analysis of 12 U.S. cities shows the combined price of water and sewage increased by an average of 80% between 2010 and 2018, and more than 2/5 of residents in some cities live in neighborhoods with unaffordable bills. They quote Roger Colton, a leading utilities analyst who is part of the Guardian team. More people are in trouble. The poorest of the poor are in big trouble. The data shows we've got an affordability problem in an overwhelming number of cities nationwide that didn't exist a decade ago, or even 2 or 3 years ago in some cities. Water bills exceeding 4% of household income are considered unaffordable. So between 2010 and 2018, water bills rose by at least 20%, while the highest increase was a staggering 154% in Austin, Texas. In Austin, the average bill rose from about $560 a year in 2010 to $1,400 in 2018. And that was during a drought period when water usage declined. But one of the things we see here in California is that the more we conserve water, the more the rates go up, because it's not the water that costs so much money. It is the pipes and the maintenance and all of that damn infrastructure. In Tucson, Arizona, the number of low-income residents facing unaffordable bills doubled to 46% by 2018, as the average bill increased by 119%. So this is one of those things that's been, bubbling below the surface under the proverbial radar. And Flint, Michigan has its own problems with poison water. But this is an issue that is certainly more widespread. Yesterday, I may have been a little vague, or I may even have misstated when Trump's next attempt at a public rally is. It is today in Phoenix. And first, he's flying to Arizona so he can go and touch his wall that doesn't wail. Yes, he wants to do a photo op. There's been a couple of 100 miles of wall that's been installed, mostly in areas where they're replacing fencing or other barriers that existed before. Then he is going to speak at a Students for Trump event in Phoenix. Despite soaring cases of coronavirus in Arizona, his campaign team is hoping for an enthusiastic turnout to get back on track. And it'll be interesting to see if the TikTok and K-pop teens strike him again. So we'll have an eye on that. Oh, also, this article quotes Frank Luntz, the Republican consultant and pollster, and he's critical of Trump in his public enunciations, his performance, like in Tulsa on Saturday night. And as you know, Frank Luntz is the guy who does focus groups to study language. He's the one who changed the name of the estate tax to the death tax because it polls so well. And he's saying that Trump uses words that make his reelection less likely because only about 6% of the American people are truly undecided. And as he laser focuses on his base and uses the language that motivates them, he is not broadening his appeal and allowing for defectors from those who voted for him in 2016. Says Luntz, he uses words that make his reelection less likely. Calling his supporters warriors appeals to his supporters, but nobody else. Americans aren't looking for a warrior. They're looking for empathy and understanding and compassion. If you're looking for a warrior, you've already decided you want Donald Trump. If you're looking for social justice, you've already decided you're voting for Joe Biden. Trump has indicated that he wants to mail another check to Americans before the election. And, of course, he's not concerned about your economic plight, about the number of people who will not be back at work by November, about the impact on families, on health, on nutrition. No, he just sees it as a way to put his signature on more documents that come into people's home with a check attached. And it is believed that Congress, after it returns from the July 4th break, will take up another bailout package. And for my money, it is, first of all, $1,200 doesn't get you diddly. And we need to focus in on the people who didn't get benefit from the unemployment boost, who didn't qualify for the original $1,200, who are facing eviction, and a stimulus program related to jobs would make a lot of sense. And I also think that in order to kind of break the cycle, the economic downturn, because the lockdown caused business losses and personal income losses. Tax revenues to state and local governments are projected to drop sharply over the next 2 years. Those same government agencies have had to spend on pandemic response. And because of the partisanship in Washington, they don't want to be sending bailout money to California. Somehow they think that that's going to cause this solid blue state to wobble and turn for Trump. And certainly there are other states that are more purple. But the idea that we're going to have partisan politics dictate who gets Washington cash that's being borrowed anyway and who doesn't is just so offensive. And here in California, they've bandaged together a budget that they say is balanced, and everybody knows it isn't. They have a lot of paper borrowing from the rainy day fund. But they have to pretend to pass a balanced budget by June 30th. And then, just like we pray for rain every fall, they have to hope for cash from Washington. And we are still offering $100 grants from the Peter B. Collins Community Fund. I have 2 requests today. Hi, my name is Kalechi Noku. I'm a nursing student who recently graduated from nursing school. didn't have a graduation, and I've been working frontline and haven't received any type of incentive for doing so. I know it's for the betterment of the world, but the same way everyone is struggling because of corona, I am too. I have a 1-year-old and I only work part-time, so it's been very difficult to make ends meet. Well, Kalechi, I'm happy to send you a check for $100. I'll be responding to you and see if you want it via PayPal or a check in the U.S. mail. And here comes Nina Jackson. She says, I'm a stay-at-home mother. I have a 15-year-old daughter. Before the virus, I did little side gigs like catering and makeup. But since it's taken over, business for me has been very scarce, and that was kind of a big part of my income. Like everyone else, the coronavirus has put a pause on a lot of things and have made many struggle to make it, including me. So we will be responding with $100 grants to both Nina and Kalechi later today. Can you use $100 for groceries, gasoline, maybe pay off that bill before the collectors call? Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. And I do request that we limit this to listeners and to people who know listeners. I've seen a wave of requests from people who don't have any real connection to this podcast community. And I'm not going to turn them down, but, my preference is to help out people who are in some way connected to this community. Well, Trump's threat was carried out by D.C. police, maybe some help from the Secret Service today. More than 100 cops in a trash truck moved people and tents away from an area that demonstrators had named the Black House Autonomous Zone on 8th Street across from the White House, and that is near the new Black Lives Matter Plaza. Trump has threatened there will never be an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C. as long as I'm your president. If they try, they will be met by force. And this followed a night where protesters tried to bring down the statue of Andrew Jackson, located near Lafayette Square there, and they were not successful. There was a weird skirmish as the police and Secret Service cleared the area, and at least temporarily last night, they ordered all reporters out of the White House. That's an unusual move, and I haven't seen any coverage of that or any real explanation. So the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkan, who has been pretty accepting of the Capitol Hill protest, called either the Autonomous Zone or the Occupied, what does CHOP stand for? Organized Protest, Capitol Hill Organized Protest. So she has signaled it is time for people to go home. It is time for us to restore Cal Anderson and Capitol Hill so it can be a vibrant part of the community. The Seattle police, said Mayor Durkan, will be returning to their precinct house, which has been boarded up for the last 10 days or so. And this follows the shootings that occurred over the weekend. We'll update that part of the story in a moment. But it appears that the tolerance for the occupation is fading, and also the support for it seems to be declining somewhat as well. So I do applaud these peaceful efforts. I'm not opposed to occupation of public spaces. And I salute those who put themselves on the line. I want to thank Paul Leto, who is a regular contributor here to the podcast when he sends me messages. He drives for Uber in Seattle. Maybe it's Lyft, I don't know, but he's a gig driver. And he wrote, your story Monday about Seattle CHOP was wrong in that you called it a protester-on-protester violence. The detailed original reporting in the Seattle Times states there's no evidence that actual protesters were the shooters, and witnesses have alleged that they were white supremacists. So far, and this could be one of the downsides of an occupation where the police are excluded, This is where the cops will move as slowly as they possibly can to investigate this in retribution for what they consider to be disrespect and undermining of their power. Leto continued, within the scope of the actual coverage, the controversy has surrounded the refusal of the EMTs and police to render aid to black men dying in the street, even when called by many to do so. A video posted to Instagram by Seattle musician Raz Simone shows that fire department medics were waiting a block away and wouldn't enter the area without the police. So the police staged 7 blocks away, and by the time they finally escorted the medical technicians in with their shields up and guns drawn, the victim had already been transported to a hospital by private car. And so at that point, people were shifted from begging to help to indignantly asking them what they were doing delaying and arriving so late with guns drawn when they were told repeatedly to come in with everyone else. So these tensions are hard for somebody like me, hundreds of miles away, to evaluate and cover. But I really appreciate Paul's first-person point of view on the scene there in Capitol Hill, Seattle. And in looking at the Seattle Times coverage, they also say there is no public evidence to suggest the shooting was connected to the protest, but neither Seattle police detectives nor fire medics reached the scene after the shootings, and they were blaming protesters, but it appears that some of that was people shouting past each other. In Washington, Senate Democrats have called Tim Scott's Republican policing bill not salvageable. So led by Chuck Schumer, Kamala Harris of California, Cory Booker of New Jersey, they sent a letter to Mitch McConnell arguing for bipartisan negotiations before the bill can advance to the floor. Now, if you understand the way the Senate works, to pull it out of committee, you need a majority vote from the committee, and then the entire Senate has to vote to take up debate on the bill. That's where the Democrats have their leverage, and they fear that they're being lied to by Republicans who say, well, just bring it to the floor, and then we'll debate and amend it, and then we'll have a law that everybody can vote for. But because of the way McConnell abuses his majority role, I think the Democrats are wise to resist this and to hold out for a better bill. Now, we get into difficult territory here because the Senate Republican bill is very weak. For example, it does not ban chokeholds, but it encourages local police and law enforcement to curtail those practices and to change their policies, induced by cash from Washington. And the Democrats simply want to outlaw chokeholds nationwide. Now, I believe they should be working on many other issues, but I don't get to set the agenda, and we have to live with who represents us in Washington, which is not always the pretty picture that we hope for. The Washington Post ran a lengthy story today, taking a look at Vallejo, California, which is just about 40 minutes east of here, a city of 122,000 people. And because of the 2008 financial crisis, Vallejo did cut the funding to its police department. And they reduced the number of cops on the streets of Vallejo from 150 to 80. And so the Post is using this as an example of what happens when you defund the police. And a lot of what they're reporting is accurate. Their conclusion is that when you reduce the number of cops, you end up with more fatal shooting by the remaining and sometimes overworked and desperate officers with guns. But my beef with this article, which I've linked to, and you can examine it for yourselves, is that it's biased in favor of more police. And while in passing it mentions that the police force has been dominated by white officers in a largely community of color, 75% are non-white, but they have long been served by a majority white police force. And because of the regularity of police shootings that lead to death of suspects, death should have been plural there, deaths of suspects, they kind of gloss over the deep distrust that community members have for what I believe is still a mostly white police force. And so they're welcome to their point of view. But in a news column, a news article, I detect a sort of bias that the reporters were ordered by their editor to find proof that defunding the police doesn't work. I've also linked to an article from the Monday San Francisco Chronicle. The East Bay correspondent is Otis R. Taylor, Jr. We interviewed him on the podcast here sometime last year, and he really dug into an interesting story. There is a white priest named Father Aidan McAleenan. He has been the pastor of the predominantly black parish, St. Columba, which is in West Oakland. Well, kind of northwest Oakland, I guess. Anyway, Father McAleenan has called Bishop Michael Barber, who is the head of the Catholic Diocese of Oakland, a racist and a liar. He said Catholic bishops are all about the white European sensibility. Now, the issues go to the merger of the predominantly black parishes, and one of them basically was merged out of existence. But McAleenan gave a sermon that was captured on video. He said, "The Bishop of Oakland is a racist. He said to me, black people should be happy with the way the church and this country has treated them. He doesn't like the black church, and that's a statement of fact." And Barber and McAleenan struggled or had a conflict after the death of the only black pastor in Oakland, the Reverend James Matthews, who was at St. Benedict Church in Oakland. And when he died, they were organizing the funeral, and the bishop objected to the inclusion of a gospel choir. And McAleenan and the others pushed back, and it does appear that they prevailed. Later, he quotes McAleenan as saying Catholic bishops are most concerned about making white people feel comfortable when it comes to race. And then the journalist Taylor writes, "There's no way," he quotes the Reverend Brian Massengale, a black professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University, who says there's no way to have an honest conversation about race in America without making white people uncomfortable. Because the honest truth is, if it were up to people of color, racism would have been over and done with centuries ago. He said the only reason racism persists is because it benefits white people, and that's a very uncomfortable truth. Here's today's COVID-19 update, ably prepared by Linda Lewis with my gratitude. Globally, the reported confirmed cases are 9.1 million, total deaths at 473,000. Total confirmed cases in the United States, 2.3 million, total deaths 120,600. And the total number of people tested to date is at about 27.5 million. In Massachusetts, those who participated in the street protests after the killing of George Floyd, well, 17,000 of them took coronavirus tests, and the positive rate came back at 2.5%. And Governor Charlie Baker said that percentage is pretty consistent with the statewide numbers seen in daily testing. He said a vast majority of the folks who participated in these demonstrations were wearing masks or face coverings of one kind or another. In many cases, people were moving, which I think made a big difference. And, of course, those demonstrations took place outside, which we all agree is far safer of an environment than indoors. Well, those are interesting points, and we have not seen significant reports of spikes in the communities where the protests were drawing the biggest crowds. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has confirmed that a rising number of new cases represents a surge that is not the result of increased testing. Now, that violates Republican talking points, and DeSantis may lose his favorite toady status under President Trump. The average rate of positive test results in Florida has nearly doubled over the past 2 weeks, rising from 5 to 9.7%. Compare that to 2.5% in Massachusetts. Hospitalizations for COVID-19 have also gone up, but fatalities and ICU availability have not yet surged to the point of generating major concern. But the State Division of Emergency Management Director Jared Moskowitz says if we don't step up and take responsibility, government itself cannot solve this problem. And a trade group representing tourism in Florida, the largest industry of the state, urged officials yesterday to crack down on dozens of eateries and bars that have failed to embrace capacity restrictions and social distancing guidelines. And that is a remarkable request from essentially a lobbying group for the hospitality industry. Similar story in Texas, where the ABC, the Alcoholic Beverage Commission, has temporarily suspended alcohol permits of 12 bars after they were found to be in violation of protocols. Texas currently requires bars to limit their indoor capacity to 50% and have customers socially distance at least 6 feet, but they found an undercover investigation dubbed Operation Safe Open that a dozen bars were not enforcing the rules. Here in California, Governor Newsom and I mentioned the budget wrangling with the legislature, but one element of this is that they rejected a plea from local public health officials for an additional $150 million a year to battle the COVID-19 pandemic and protect against future public health threats. Newsom is looking at a $54 billion deficit for the fiscal year that starts July 1, and he says the state must make painful decisions before his deadline to sign a balanced budget into law. Also, a similar problem in Wisconsin, where the state faces budget cuts and officials are asking for more public health money. Trump administration aides in recent weeks have seriously discussed launching an in-depth evaluation of the Centers for Disease Control, and this could be part of their blame game. After all, first it was China, then it was the World Health Organization, and there have been conflicts with the CDC as the Trump administration and Trump himself have sought to stifle the agency when, for example, it offered guidelines for reopening churches. Trump has turned the tables on his loyal staffers who defended his comment in Tulsa the other night, saying that he wanted them to slow down on testing. They said, oh, that was in jest. Peter Navarro, Vice President Pence, they all tried to play it down. But Trump, he just contradicted them in their own lies. He said, I don't kid. Let me just tell you. Let me make it clear. When pressed on whether his comments were intended as a joke. And Dr. Anthony Fauci was at a hearing on Capitol Hill today, the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He said, none of us have ever been told to slow down on testing. In fact, we will be doing more testing, said Fauci. And he went on to answer other questions, including getting into a bit of a testy exchange with a Republican member of Congress. That would be David McKinley of West Virginia. He asked Fauci about the belated guidance for Americans to wear face coverings. and was trying to blame Fauci. Do you now regret not advising people more forcefully to wear masks earlier? Fauci got testy. He should do that more often. Okay, we're going to play that game. Let me explain to you back what happened back then. McKinley told him he wanted only a yes or no, but Fauci declined. He said, nope, there's more than a yes or no by the tone of your question. I don't regret that because at that time there was a limited amount of equipment that our healthcare providers needed. We did not want to divert masks and PPE away from them to be used by the public. And what he fails to really drive home is the point that this was a massive failure of preparation by the Trump administration. Also, Fauci responding to a question from a Democratic member of Congress about whether he was consulted on the decision to withdraw the U.S. from the World Health Organization. I was not specifically consulted about the withdrawal or the attempt to withdraw, said Fauci. Does he have any concerns about the president's plans related to the WHO? Fauci, yes, I do. Despite any policy issues, he said, that come from higher up in the White House, we at the operational level continue to interact with the WHO in a very meaningful way and on a day-by-day basis. Fauci was also asked if he had ever advised Trump to wear a face mask, and he basically just said, no. And finally, from our COVID report, the safety of air travel is being kind of three stooges in different departments, because the Department of Transportation says that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services should be providing standards and not the Department of Transportation. And Linda Lewis, a veteran of government agency wrangling, notes that the responsibilities in this regard of the Department of Transportation and the FAA are similar to those of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC works with FEMA and HHS on emergency preparedness. But while FEMA works with state and local governments to guide their planning, and HHS provides public guidance on radiation safety, only the NRC works directly with nuclear power companies on issues related to design and maintenance of the power plants. Foisting NRC's responsibilities onto the other agencies which lack nuclear engineering expertise would be irrational and dangerous. Similarly, the Department of Transportation and FAA cannot rationally dump their responsibilities onto agencies that lack its technical expertise and ongoing industry relationships. Nobody wants to have their fingerprints on that particular policy. I want to commend our friend and the intrepid environmental investigative journalist Steve Horn, who broke another story. And this relates to the Newsom administration here in California. The governor, with some fanfare, issued a moratorium on fracking last year. But under the fog of COVID, on June 1st, the Newsom administration quietly issued 12 fracking permits to Era Energy, a joint venture of ExxonMobil and Shell. The 12 new permits will be for fracking in the Lost Hills oil field, which is in Kern County. Bakersfield is the major city there. And Lost Hills is a minority community, 97% Latino. And we've seen the disproportionate health impacts on minority communities from industrial facilities, including fracking sites. So this came just months after the Newsom administration said it was taking actions to manage the decline of oil production and consumption in the state. And two of the top advisors who lobby for ERA also have close ties to Newsom. Jason Kinney, who's been around Sacramento for decades now as a juiced-up fixer. He headed up Newsom's 2018 transition team and used to serve as a senior advisor to Newsom when he was lieutenant governor. And he is a senior advisor to California's Senate Democrats. The other guy is Kevin Schmidt, previously a policy director for Newsom, and Era paid Axiom, their firm, $110,000 for lobbying last year, and so far has paid about $30,000, according to lobbying reports. So those two insiders appear to have persuaded the governor to help rescue the foundering oil industry in California, which was foundering not because of COVID-19 directly, although there has been, of course, there was a period of time there where people were using less gasoline. But the industry was on its knees before that because of the worldwide oil glut. And Horn quotes Jamie Court, the president of the LA-based consumer watchdog group. Era should not be able to buy the influence it apparently has over state oil and gas policy. So this is a stinky story. And Gavin Newsom is generally well regarded. He has critics because he was pretty heavy-handed in issuing executive orders to manage the pandemic. But in general, he has broad support in the state. But this is a real negative on his environmental policies and his consistency as well. And it does appear that his well-paid lobbyist former advisors may hold sway over him in ways that, that I wouldn't approve of. I'll put it that way. Today is the delayed primary election in New York State. It's reported that at many precincts where people went to vote, they failed to receive the primary election ballot. That is the presidential primary where Bernie Sanders and some others are still on the ballot with Joe Biden. And this appears to be an extension of the effort by this two-person elections commission that tried to cancel the presidential primary election in New York altogether in order to protect people from exposure to coronavirus, which is a bizarre explanation. We're also learning that there were 700,000 absentee ballots distributed in New York City, but many people who showed up at the polls did so because they did not receive the mail-in ballots that they requested. The New York Times quotes a man from Brooklyn, Wesley Smith. His absentee ballot never arrived. I requested an absentee ballot twice and never received them. Wow, they're using Georgia tactics in New York now? Facebook has been notified by some major advertisers that they're going to take a break from advertising on the social media platform. These include North Face, REI, and Patagonia, along with Mozilla and Upwork. They're doing this to pressure Mark Zuckerberg to adopt stricter policies against racist and hateful comments or content on the platform. And while I generally support that notion, we do have to take care to avoid outright censorship. And that is the balance that is difficult to strike in this complicated effort to, try to make Facebook more responsive and also try to stop Trump from spewing his lies. But Zuckerberg has proven to be pretty firm in his position. And finally today, I want to recommend a commentary piece by our friend Gareth Porter, published today at thegrayzone.com. It gives us background and context on the story I reported the other day, that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, issued a resolution on June 19th calling on Iran to fully comply with agency demands for cooperation. And what Porter shares with us is the dubious reporting from Israel that they were able to raid a warehouse in Tehran, and they allegedly picked up documents from 2003. And the most significant document is shown in a photograph included with this report, and it's a page of handwritten notes with a logo on the top. It doesn't seem to be a very official document. But what Porter points out in his article is that the IAEA appears to be suffering from excessive pressure from the United States and Israel to adopt this resolution, which is based on information that is questionable at best. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain your humble host, Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.